As I got closer to the car in front, the bumper sticker stood out at me. It said, if you were accused of being a Christian, would there be enough evidence to convict you? Through the centuries, people have displayed many different symbols to show that they're Christians. Pins and lapels of coats, chains about necks, even special haircuts. However, there's a much better sign. There is a mark that is universal, that will last till Christ comes. At the close of Christ's ministry, as he neared the cross, knowing that he's about to leave, he makes clear the distinguishing mark of a Christian. John 13, 34 and 35. Jesus says, a new commandment I give unto you, that you love one another as I have loved you, that you also love one another. And then he adds, by this shall all men know that you are my disciples, if you have love one to another. This is a command to be obeyed or violated. You make your choice. People, if we expect people to know that indeed we are Christians, today we must show that mark. That's the words of Christ. Now we know that we're supposed to love fellow Christians, but we're also called to love all, even the unlovely. Okay? All individuals within the church and without bear the image of God. Now I say that today because modern man has downgraded the value of a person and produced what we see happening in today's society, a sick world culture that even the religious treat those with whom they disagree as inhumane. Even the religious cut the heads off of people who disagree with them religiously and video it on YouTube and cable TV. However, we are to love on the basis of creation all. That includes all those who drastically disagree with us. That love needs to be there. Some we're to love on the basis of recreation. They have accepted Christ as we have, and they are believers, and we accept them on that. This is the whole point of the Good Samaritan story there in the New Testament. Paul makes this point, this double application to the Galatian Christians, those Christians that were gathered there as members of that Galatian church. A church that was struggling on the issue of the treatment of fellow believers. This is a church that had some issues amongst themselves. Galatians, the 6th chapter, the 10th verse, if you'll tune back to that church of long ago with me today, Galatians, the 6th chapter. When you get done with Acts and Romans and you get the get ones, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, or Galatians, that book. Galatians, the 6th chapter, verse 10, where Paul counsels this church, this group of believers. As we have therefore opportunity, he says, let us do good unto all men, especially unto those who are of the household of faith. So this double application is to be our Christian mentality, as you would say. Very often, the Christian, and I cringe to say this, but it is true. The Christian, in relating to the believers and to non-believers have portrayed a picture of exclusiveness that can be ugly. And that means that caution should rule us in showing us how to deal and how we show or fail to love both those within and without the church. At times, we can be more exclusive in relating to fellow believers in the church than we are to the outsiders. Consider another text with me, another church in Thessalonica. The book of Thessalonians, the first book of Thessalonians there in the New Testament, the 3rd chapter. 1 Thessalonians, the 3rd chapter, and the 12th verse. 1 Thessalonians 3, verse 12. Paul writes, "And the Lord make you to increase and abound in love one toward another and toward all men, even as we do towards you." You see, it was another church struggling with this issue of showing love. First, there's the Galatian church. And then there's another church, the Thessalonican church. This love thing, it's not automatic because you're part of a group of believers. 1 John 3:11, those three little books toward the end of the New Testament in the 3rd chapter, John says, "For this is a message that you have heard from the beginning, that you should love one another." Now, this book of John was written years after the death of Jesus Christ. And he says, don't forget. This is John coming back years after Jesus has left and says, don't forget, this is to be your mark, that you are loving to those within and outside the church. The 13th chapter of Paul's letter to the Corinthian church, we know it well, don't we? Another church, so you have the Galatian church, and you have the Thessalonican church, and you have now you have the Corinthian church. Paul deals a whole chapter to list in details the description of love and what it is and what it's not. There seems to be a concerted effort by the writers to the New Testament churches to point out the vital need and the apparent lack of brotherly and sisterly love amongst the churches. Disagreements, selfishness, and disrespect for others were creeping in and hampering these three churches' efforts to communicate and witness, both as a body of believers and as an effective witnessing body. Was there a diminishing love problem, would you say, in those three churches? Consider the developing concern on our own worldwide and local debates over issues. We have issues about ladies, and we have issues about things. Who should be preachers and who should not. I wonder how we treat each other if we disagree about that issue. So let's, for a moment, revisit today's text in John 13, and I want to talk to you a little bit about that. John's Gospel, the 13th through the 17th chapters, are sandwiched in between chapters 12 and chapters 18. So you got chapter 12, and you got chapter 18, and then in between are chapters 13 through 17. So chapter 12, let's talk about the one that precedes these 5 chapters, 13 through 18. Chapter 12 in the book of John talks about a final visit and meal with Jesus with Martha and Mary and Lazarus. Following that, there's the triumphal entry into Jerusalem where the people put out the palm branches and welcome as a king. And this was followed by the Greeks at that time that came sought to see him, those from not Israel, but from Greece. And they wanted to see him, and they believed in him. In fact, this was a time that Satan used right there as Jesus was ready to go into the final act of what he was going to do upon this earth. This was used by Satan to tempt Jesus to bypass what he was supposed to do. Hey, the Greeks came to him and says, hey, never mind these Hebrews, we believe. Come over to Greece and it's an open heart to receive what you got to say. He was accepted. He was popular there, they were saying in Greece. But Christ did not leave his stated purpose and his stated plan. This was followed by a voice from heaven. Now, we know about the voice from heaven that comes when John baptized him. But this is a voice from heaven that came at this particular time, right as he finished the triumphal entry and the Greek came to him. A voice from heaven expressing approval of Jesus and everything that he had done. Immediately, this is the 12th chapter of John, immediately Jesus hid himself from the crowds. It was all over. His task that he came for was completed. Now on to the end. The crucifixion loomed straight ahead. Oh, and that's John the 12th chapter. On the other side of this sandwich, you got John the 12th chapter, and then you got John the 18th chapter. And the 18th chapter begins where Jesus goes to Gethsemane, where Judas betrays him with a kiss. And in between, this is what I want you to focus on. In between this 12th chapter of John and this 18th chapter of John are 5 chapters, chapters 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17. These chapters were about a time when Jesus and the 12 disciples spent some time exclusively together, where he preps them for the events to be from Gethsemane to the cross. He preps them for the future. This last private time with Jesus, with his 12 disciples, just him and them, the private session of 5 chapters. It begins in these 5 chapters, 13 through 17, with what became known as the Lord's Supper and feet washing, where Jesus gathered them together there and they observed what we call today the Lord's Supper or communion. And he ended up washing their feet because they were too proud to wash each other's feet. And these 5 chapters, in between chapter 12 and chapter 18, they end with his last prayer in John 17, where he prays for them. So the 17th chapter is a prayer for the disciples. I want you to go back to John 13:1, if you will. Now, I know we're using a number of texts today, but we got to get what Jesus is doing. John, the 13th chapter, verse 1, sets a tone for what these 5 chapters are going to be about. Verse 1, John 13. Now, before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour was come, that he should depart out of this world unto the Father. Having loved his own which were in the world, he loved them until the end. Now, in these 5 chapters of St. John's Gospel, John 13 through verse 17, the word love is mentioned 34 times. Out of the 155 verses, some 4,000 words, 1 out of every 4 verses deals with this love. So here Jesus gathers the disciples together to prep them for the future. This is his last time with them, and love seems to be the overall theme of this special time together. This special time of final preparation given by Jesus to the 12 is reported by John in these 5 chapters. However, Matthew, Mark, Luke, those 3 of the 4 gospel writers record the first part, the Passover meal together. But only John reports the material found in chapters 14, 15, 16, and 17. You will not find it in the other gospels. You see, John, having written his gospel much later than the other 3, inserts into his gospel the material found in John chapters 14 through 17. John, in his writings, written a generation or more, 20, 30, 40 years later, had time to go over the books of Matthew, Mark, and Luke and their accounts. The other authors of the New Testament Gospels had either from natural causes or from martyrdom died. John had taken a different tactic than Paul as an evangelist, than James as an administrator, a different tactic than Peter the popular zealot, who had questioned Christ about John's future, and Jesus basically told him, "What's it to you?" You remember that one? He says to Peter, "What's it to you if John lives forever till I come?" Well, John did live longer than any other apostle. He lived near 100 years old. John had a career of 25 years as a pastor. He pastored 7 churches at one time, the 7 churches of Asia, as a big district of churches, and he identifies himself as such. Sort of retiring, whatever that is, Vicki, and writing what became the 5 books of the New Testament. He wrote the John 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17 in his 80s and 90s. You can see John fully kept the emphasis of crucial importance of the love one to another that Jesus so spoke of in these 4 chapters that John inserted into his gospel. Let's look at that declaration of Jesus once again in the 13th chapter of John, verses 34 and 35, if you will. John 13, 34 and 35. This is Jesus sitting there with the 12 disciples, his last private time with them, training them as to how they're to take the gospel to the world. He says, "A new commandment I give unto you, that you love one another as I have loved you, that you love one another." And then he adds in verse 35, "By this shall all men know that you are my disciples, if you have love one to another." Now notice the kind of love, as Jesus says, it's the kind of love I have. Jesus' work was to continue just as he had conducted it. And Jesus gives the world, that's those outside of the church, the right to judge whether we are true disciples of Jesus or not on the basis of our love for each other. Now, I want you to notice carefully that we may be Christians and yet at times we fail in our love for each other. Have you never noticed that? Have you ever noticed that sometimes people don't love you like they ought to love you? Or let's turn it around. Maybe we haven't loved them like we need to love them. Now, I know there are people that have said to me, when you talk about love, you're talking about water that's 1 inch thick and a mile wide, and we need to go deep. But I'm here to say that the love is deep, as the little children sang, deep and wide when you talk about Jesus' love. We may fail in our love because we are not perfect. But Christ does give us a reasonable thermometer, A mark that if the world doesn't see, it allows the world who we're trying to witness to conclude that this person is not a Christian. So if they do not see that love in us, they have the right given them by Jesus Christ himself to say that person is not a Christian. Jesus is here saying that we have a responsibility as individuals and as a church to so love other Christians that the world has no valid reason to ever say that we are not Christians. And now comes something that's even more sobering. John, the 17th chapter, the last of those 5 chapters that John inserted in there about love. John 17, verses 20 through 23. Verse 20. Neither pray I for these alone, but also for them which shall believe on me through their word. Jesus in John 17 prayed for us. Why would he do that? Because he knew we would need it, wouldn't he? He knew we would. When Christ prayed that prayer in John 17, the whole chapter, prayer for Christ, for his disciples and for us, he specifically prayed for you and for me. We were on his mind. Verse 21 of that 17th chapter. That they all may be one as thou, Father, in me are one in thee. That they may also be one in us, that the world may believe that thou hast sent me. And the glory which thou gavest me I have given them, that they may be one even as we are one. I in them, and thou in me, that they may be made perfectly one. And I want you to notice the last part of that 23rd verse. That the world may know that thou hast sent me and hast loved them as thou hast loved me. When the world, people outside of the church, observe us, we cannot, Jesus is saying, we cannot expect them to believe that the Father sent the Son and sends us to be his ambassadors unless they see this love, this oneness amongst ourselves. Now in John 13 and 17, where he talks about this, Jesus does not speak of an invisible church, but a visible one. A real seeable oneness, a real practicing oneness. You see, a Christian has a double task. We have to practice God's holiness and God's love. If we practice the holiness without the love, that's harshness. If we practice the love without the wholeness, that's compromise. We cannot call right wrong, and we cannot call wrong right, can we? We can't do that. If others do not see this formula amongst us as Christians, they have the right to make these 2 awful judgments. Number 1, that we are not Christians. And number 1, that Christ was not sent by God, and neither were they, that God doesn't love everyone, and neither do we. I would suggest that there are 3 practical answers as to when we disagree. Now, whether you're a long-time member of a church, whether you're a long-time member of this congregation, or whether you're new, whether you're a new believer in the faith or not, you are ordained by God when you accept Jesus to witness, aren't you? You're ordained by God to share these truths that you have learned, whether you've been a long time in the church or just fresh. And 3 practical answers as to when we disagree would be well for us all. Number 1, never come to differences without regret and tears. Now, some fight over anything or something. Sometimes we're pleased, as the Sabbath school lesson said today, to build ourselves up by tearing others down. The world must know that when Christians differ, They do not differ because they love the smell of the bullfight, okay? They must know that. And then number two, the more serious the differences, the greater the love displayed. Humanity, we practice it opposite. If it's not something real important, then the more love we give them. But if it's something really important, then the less love we give and the madder we get. And then number three, I would suggest that we approach the problem with a desire to solve it, not a desire to win it. You see, today the world may not understand what we Christians are disagreeing about, but they will quickly understand the differences between our differences and theirs. If they see our love, if they see our oneness. So if you're going out, if you've been in church a long time, or if you just learned some new truths and you go out and you share it with others, the degree to which they're going to believe what you say has to do with the degree of love that they see in your life. I challenge you today to take your Bibles, whether paper book or smartphone, and read through carefully and thoughtfully with prayer and study, and go over John, these 13 through 17 chapters there, observing what Jesus thought was the crucial importance as his last message to his people. Ask yourself, do those who know me see me as a person of love? Do I exhibit that love to others? Yeah, if someone did accuse me of being a Christian, would there be enough evidence to convict me? Do others see that mark? Let us not speak, not act, or seek to show our love, but point them to Jesus Christ in John 3:16, 17. Can you say that with me? For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. For God sent not his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. May the cross of Christ be our focus. To Calvary, to the scene of God's unfailing love, may our life and our words point.
Unfailing love flows from his heart and heals my soul. In spite of who I am, he loves and makes me whole. I almost can't believe it's true, unfailing love, and yet I know he gave his love to give to me, unfailing love. Unfailing love flows from his heart and heals my soul. In spite of who I am, he loves and makes me whole. I almost can't believe it's true, unfailing love, and yet I know he gave his love to give to me, spite of who I am, He loves and makes me whole. I almost can't believe